Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online. News that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Thank you for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. Over the next month, we are partnering with the NAACP of Doña County to focus on civil rights issues. Today, we welcome local members of the New Mexico Civil Rights Commission, Doña County Sheriff Kim Stewart and County District Attorney Gerald Byers. My co-host is NAACP President Dr. Bobbie Green. Welcome to all of you, and Bobbie, I know you have the first question.
Good morning, Fred, and thank you for this opportunity. My first question, I'm going to start with DA Byers. Tell us your thoughts on the proposals that have been developed by the New Mexico Civil Rights Commission to protect the rights of citizens in our state.
Thank you very much for having me, and Dr. Green, I really appreciate your question. It's an important one. I think it's a good start, but since it is an important one, there needs to be more. There should be follow-up associated with it. The effort arose from the public outcry that developed over last summer about the obvious police misconduct as it pertains to people of color. And there was a desire for people to do something about infringement on civil rights. And so I believe that the legislature took that step in order to start that process. However, the manner in which the proposed legislation in House Bill 4 came about, I think maybe at least the dissenters believe that it was off track. And so, like I said, I believe that it is a first start. It is a good start. However, it should not end there, because if we take a look back to in our history during the civil rights movement of the 60s, I was a little kid during that time. Gains came by fits and starts. Gains came by one step at a time. But the motivating factor behind it was the awareness of the public and the involvement of the public and the outcry that was seen across the nation and around the world this last summer definitely put a focus on that point where our nation needs to improve.
Thank you. Sheriff Stewart, I'm going to ask you the same question. What are your thoughts on the proposals that have been developed by the New Mexico Civil Rights Commission?
Well, first let me say thank you, Dr. Green, and to Fred Martino for inviting me on this wonderful start to a month of history and civil rights discussions. I also agree that the Civil Rights Commission, I believe, is poorly named. I believe it gives the impression that it was far sweeping, or it's designed to be far sweeping changes in how we look at the policing in particular and generally in government service. And it really wasn't any of those things. And so I do concur with Mr. Byers that we need to move on from this and get into some real issues that affect our lives, mine, yours, everyone's, every day. This was misnamed in that if you don't agree with it, it appears that you're against civil rights. And I will say that none of us on the commission are against civil rights. And those who may be desiring to vote against it now in the legislature, it will not be because they're against civil rights.
Thank you very much for that, and we appreciate both of you joining us today. I know one of the issues that the Civil Rights Commission is tasked with looking at is this idea of qualified immunity. Kim, I want to begin with you on this and your thoughts on qualified immunity, your position on this, and if you can explain your position, why you have the position that you do.
First, qualified immunity truly is a judicial construct. It is a court by court decision, case by case. So the thought that qualified immunity would immediately and forever absolve someone, for instance, in law enforcement, from any kind of litigation is erroneous. So nationally, there is no database to actually determine how many cases or how many instances is someone excused from qualified immunity. Also, qualified immunity actually covers a number of professions: teachers, CYFD, social workers, nurses who work for the state. There are a number of professions that would be impacted if we got rid of qualified immunity. The other thing is that the commission voted to get rid of qualified immunity 5-4, with me being a dissenter as well, and yet voted 9-0 to indemnify us. So as long as we're within the scope of policy and or the law, we're covered anyway. So I found that juxtaposition very interesting, to say the least. So I'm against getting rid of qualified immunity in far sweeping legislation like this. Perhaps on a more specific directed focus, it's something to look at. It's just in this venue, it is not appropriate.
Okay, Gerald, your thoughts on this? Same idea, your thoughts on qualified immunity?
I echo Sheriff Stewart's position and would just have a few points to offer because on the one hand, qualified immunity, it's a buffer between the government and the government actors and people who are civilly trying to redress a wrong. But the thing is that it that prevents a chilling effect, because if a law enforcement officer or other government actor were totally exposed to severe financial penalty just for an act that arose out of them doing their job, that would really chill the desire of people to be public servants. However, one of the things that it's totally true what Sheriff Stewart mentioned, when it came to the point of voting on whether or not qualified immunity should be supported, interestingly, all of the members of the Civil Rights Commission decided, hold on now, we will not vote to impose this penalty on the individual bad actor, in complete juxtaposition to what the bill had been advertised as being, to hold the bad actor law enforcement officer accountable. And I'll just interject and say that I've spoken with a number of law enforcement officers since this Civil Rights Commission commenced. And I can tell you that there are many, many law enforcement officers who want only the best officers in their ranks. They want only supreme experienced professionals who are totally committed to serving the public. And they have no tolerance for those folks who just barely skate by or skirt the rules or are abusive to people. And so this is a work in progress, but I think it's a good start, but we should, improvement is required.
Thank you. Bobbie?
Yes, thank you. DA Byers, I'm going to come back to you again and ask you, what laws do you think should be endorsed by the New Mexico Civil Rights Commission to protect public peace, health, and safety?
During the course of the Civil Rights Commission discussions, it became very, very clear that we had input from a number of very knowledgeable and well-meaning people, and were permitted to bring in experts. And it became clear that under New Mexico law, currently, New Mexico Tort Claims Act, actions can be brought civilly against law enforcement officers. It would not surprise me if that act also served as a means to bring actions against other government actors. But I don't practice in the civil realm. I'm a criminal prosecutor, so I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on that. However, what I can say is that that Tort Claims Act has proven effective. It is the means whereby a lot of cases where a law enforcement actor has been engaged in some in some violation of rights or wrongdoing, that a person can get redress for the violation of those rights. And so I would, to answer your question directly, that's where I would focus the attention.
Thank you. Sheriff Stewart, what are your thoughts on the laws that should be endorsed by the New Mexico Civil Rights Commission to protect public peace, health, and safety?
First, the Civil Rights Commission was set up by legislation to do two very specific things. One was to look at qualified immunity and its possible dismissal, so to speak, from the legal world. And second of all, it was to look at bringing states, bringing civil right options to the state, as opposed to being able to or being challenged with going before a federal judge. So we were established for just two reasons. We weren't not established to support any other laws, to look at other laws or legislation, or to look at potential solutions. So I certainly also look at the issues Mr. Byers speaks to, but also be aware that that was not our mandate.
Okay. Of course, these issues and many more are also in the national spotlight, as you all know. President Biden recently signed an executive order in his efforts to dismantle systemic racism. The measures seek to do a number of things: strengthen anti-discrimination housing policies that were weakened by the previous administration, halt new Justice Department contracts with private prisons, increase the sovereignty of Native American tribes, and combat violence and xenophobia against Asian Americans. Kim, I want to begin with you on this and your thoughts on these actions, and if you'd like to see follow-up from Congress on this.
I'm not sure that I would want to entertain congressional direction or interest at this point, but let me go back to President Obama's term. He had a National Law Enforcement Task Force on 21st century policing. They issued a final report at the end of his second term. It has some important input or suggestions for us as a profession going forward. And I really believe that given that President Biden was a partner in that administration, I believe he will work to reinstitute or re-establish a law enforcement task force nationwide. And you might say, well, you know, what can this possibly do? Well, for one thing, they speak to what are called more soft characteristics. They speak to culture change. And those are important words, because at the end of the day, you can have all the policies and procedures you want written, but often officers resort to what is acceptable in their culture. And that is what needs to be looked at on a national basis.
Okay, thank you. Gerald, your thoughts on President Biden's executive order and whether you think there should be follow-up from Congress.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martino. I believe that President Biden's executive orders are very consonant and supportive of what he was campaigning on. It resonates with the desires of the many, many people within the U.S. public. And I'll start with first the halting of contracts by the Justice Department with private prisons. Now, I'm a state prosecutor, and the executive order is federal, and the Justice Department is federal, and so my comments don't directly go with regard to that jurisdiction. However, I will say this. It is very, very indicative, I believe, of a very strong moral point, and that is acknowledging the dignity of every human being. Back before I took office, and during this last summer, that was one of the rallying cries of everyone around the country and around the world, is acknowledging and respecting the dignity of every human being. And how this links back to whether or not there's a contract with a private prison for the maintenance and upkeep of a person who is serving a government sentence, well, it links toward someone making profit off of the misery of another person because that person has lost their liberty. The only way a person can lose their liberty is through government action. And then there's going to be a profit made off of that. It sort of reeks of slavery. And interestingly enough, when we look at the 13th Amendment, it carves out a little exception that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States except for a punishment of a crime that the person has been duly convicted of, or pretty close to that quote. So our country's dark past with regard to degrading individuals who are without liberty could not even survive the being excised out of the 13th Amendment. And so when we go forward to 2021, and we're talking about private businesses being able to make money off of someone who has lost their liberty, I think we're better than that. I think that the government, whether it's a state government or a federal government, is responsible for managing the manner in which a person repays their debt to society after they've been duly convicted. It should not be in the hands of a private entity, period, in my humble opinion.
Thank you very much for that. Bobbie?
Thank you. Speaking of being better than that, Sheriff Stewart, efforts to overturn the results of the election and disregard for the votes of more than 80 million citizens has exposed a country divided. What can our elected officials do to bridge that divide?
Well, that's a question for the century, isn't it? But I will say that from my own small world of being an elected official, I think that we need to take more of an issue-driven stance as opposed to a right or left stance, that perhaps the way to find common ground with those who disagree is to focus on issues that can bring us together. And I think that's a challenge as an elected official. In some ways, my life is easier because I'm elected over a profession. I have professional obligations and a mission, as do my staff. So in that sense, I'm a little bit more able to maybe straddle that divide. But I do believe that that's a way we can begin to mend what is, without question, an enormous divide in the United States.
DA Byers, I'm interested in your thoughts about this. What can we do, what can you do as an elected official, and what can our leaders do to bridge the divide?
Well, thank you for the question. It's sometimes maybe my answer may seem simplistic, but we can start with respecting the humanity of other people who may disagree with us on a certain point. We can focus on speaking the truth. There is such a thing out there as objective truth. We can denounce and eradicate disinformation. What people may not realize is that there's a lot of disinformation that is being intentionally sown in our means whereby we obtain information, if it's social media or whatever. But we can see the incredible impact that disinformation can have. And also holding wrongdoers accountable. I enforce the law. I'm a district attorney. So it's not my role to create the law or shade it one way or the other. And so if a person has violated something that our legislature has declared to be contrary to the interests of the state of New Mexico, then that person should be held accountable, whether they are on the left or they are on the right, because the law is supposed to take a neutral viewpoint and thereby protect the interests of everyone. And I think that if we pause, took a deep breath, and let go of those forces that pull us to the fringe and to the extremes, and instead rejoined with each other in the middle somewhere, we would all be in a better place.
Thank you for that. Of course, the divide in our country has raised another very important issue that we want to touch on today. And we got inkling of this actually during the election season, when we learned of a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. We learned further when we saw, all of us, in disbelief, the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, and that is domestic terrorism. Kim, I want to begin with you on this, and I want to get your thoughts on what you think is needed to combat domestic terrorism. As you know, a lot of people right now, even people who are not elected officials, who are not working in a public duty in law enforcement, a lot of people are very worried right now.
And so am I, quite frankly. I believe that we first must admit, in a world of white privilege, such as I exist in, that white people can be dangerous. That's the bottom line. I think that there was a grave lack of awareness that largely white people stormed the Capitol with all sorts of notice given to all of us across the country that there was going to be something occurring. And I don't think it was taken seriously. And even locally over the last couple of years, you know, when we've had discussions in public forums about gun ownership and the right to possess gun ownership, there has been this idea that, well, they're white people with guns, they're safe. I mean, I've had people say that to me. Well, they're not going to be a problem. They're just white gun owners. So I think if you look at the response when Black Lives Matter was going to be protesting, and you look at the response on January 6th, I don't know how anybody can look at that and not say there was a grave discrepancy in how seriously or not seriously that assault was taken. I think that for 4 years we've had a great really disservice to those who serve in our intelligence community, with really no one listening or no one in power listening, and the fact that they've been so undermined that it's that community that is certainly going to be the key to keeping a focus on the growing domestic terrorism front. It is just a huge task, I believe, that whole intelligence community has to overcome right now. But that's where we're going to be able to keep track and to monitor this growing segment of our population. And frankly, I believe it is growing.
Okay. Gerald, your thoughts on this, maybe about a minute. We hope to get one more question in.
Great. I agree with Sheriff Stewart's comments very much. I'll try to truncate it down. I specifically, with regard to identifying the difference in the response to a Black Lives Matter protest to the difference in response by security officials to the mob on January 6th. And that should prompt an introspection into why there is that difference. And then once a person makes a value judgment about that, then they can move forward and implement change and improvement. It's also important to publicize what domestic terrorism is, because right now in the New Mexico statutes, there's only one statute that addresses anti-terrorism. And if you engage in those types of conduct, then you're going to get penalized by a whopping 4th degree felony, which carries an 18-month sentence or $5,000. Okay. So what is it? And we think about the impact of domestic terrorism. and the impact on the lives of the people and how unsettling it is. So we should revisit that.
Okay, thank you very much, Bobbie. You have the last question. We have about 30 seconds for each answer.
Thank you. The New Mexico Civil Rights Commission is only authorized through the end of March. So what should come after that? DA Byers, I'll start with you.
Sure, thank you, and I'll keep it brief. I believe that the best place that we can start is a top to bottom overhaul and overview of the Law Enforcement Academy to provide more funding, more independent funding, to provide better training, to provide improvement of infrastructure and expand its capabilities and also its ability to certify or decertify individuals who are not in compliance with the standards of the profession. Law enforcement is a long-standing, very noble profession, and it needs the total support of the community, and it needs the total support of our legislatures in order to make sure that our communities, small and large, receive the best law enforcement officers that are available.
Thank you. Sheriff Stewart, what do you think should come next?
Well, first, I concur with Mr. Byers on that point. A true human rights commission, I think, is the next step. A true commission where we can bring together all sorts of ideas to begin to move some of these boulders out of our way. I'm reminded of a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. Human rights begin in small places, close to home. They are the world of the individual person. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seek equal justice. I think a commission is long overdue that really looks at human rights.
Doña County Sheriff Kim Stewart, District Attorney Gerald Byers, and the President of the NAACP, Dr. Bobbie Green. Thank you all for being with us and for sharing your thoughts on this incredibly important issue.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Well, that is our time. Join us this week on KRWG Radio every weekday. It's morning edition from 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.